So, welcome to Thursday. Oh my gosh, it's been that kind of a week. I'm glad you're here for chapter 7 of Finding Atticus. Before we start, you know that I like to give some vocabulary words. So, today's words that I picked out: compelled, to feel that you have to do something. Ornately means that it's fancy, kind of a fancy decoration or carving. Rookie, which means that you're new. Hoisted means to lift. Catapulted, to send something flying through the air or to fly through the air. Rickety, not in good shape and not stable. So those are our vocab words for the day. And I'm not going to ask a question at the end, but instead today, if there are any students who are watching, instead of answering questions, I think it would be cool if maybe you drew a picture of what you see the cabin looking like, where Atticus is. And you'll get a little more description today. Maybe draw a scene from the cabin. That cabin, I'll just tell you, is... Hi, Lori. Hi, Phyllis. The cabin that is described in the book is actually a cabin that my younger brother and I built when we were kids. Our older siblings had started it, and then we added to it out in the woods. And the other day when I was taking my father for a drive past our old home where I grew up, I actually stopped and took a picture from a distance of that area. So I'll share it to the page later, just so that you can see what I picture as far as approaching the woods goes. So here we go with chapter 7. It's Friday afternoon, and it's called Spiders That Bite. Grandpa Reston scrubbed the sandpaper across the curved edge on the lid of the wooden chest and then smoothed his hand across the area. Not quite satisfied, he folded the sandpaper and pressed harder. The swish swish of the coarse paper against the wood filled the small wood shop with rhythmic noise. The next step would be to stain it the light oak color that Wade, Jamie's father, had selected, because it would match the other woodwork in Jamie's bedroom. Wade had started crafting the hope chest at the end of the previous summer, but he'd died before finishing it. He'd put great effort, time, and love into ornately carving Jamie's initials on the top. Since his death, the unfinished box had sat covered in the corner of Grandpa's woodshop. It was supposed to be a gift from him for Jamie on her 14th birthday. With 2 weeks until that day, Grandpa Reston was compelled to fulfill his oldest son's wishes. The door to his workshop opened and a breeze slid in and swirled around him. That was followed by his wife, Jean, carrying a small tray with 2 glasses filled with ice and a small pitcher of iced tea with lemons bobbing on the top. "I thought you could use a little refreshment," she said. Even though she was a slight woman, as she crossed the wood floor, the century-old boards creaked. "You're a doll." He leaned back on the wooden stool, one of the first pieces of furniture he'd ever made, and took the drink she'd poured. "Thank goodness it's not as hot as yesterday." He gulped almost 3/4 of the drink before stopping to take a breath. He wiped his upper lip with the back of his hand. Jean took a few sips from her glass of tea and then reached out with her finger to trace the etched initials on the top of the chest. "Oh, Ed, this is going to be such a precious gift for Jamie when she finds out that her father made it for her." Ed nodded. A lot of sweat and love went into it, that's for sure. He tipped his glass up and drained the rest of the beverage. "I have the easiest part with the staining and then putting on the polyurethane. I'll be able to start that later today." He handed the glass back to Jean, then wiped the moisture from his hands onto his long khaki shorts. "He was such a good son," Jean mused. "And father," Ed added quietly. At the same time, they both looked toward the hook on the far side of the workbench. Wade's fire coat, from when he joined the volunteer department as a rookie, hung there. Reston, Reston, was sewn on the back with reflective letters. His soot-stained helmet hung by the strap on another hook next to it. When Wade had been promoted to regular firefighter status and received new gear, he'd thrown the old equipment away. Ed had pulled it from the trash and proudly hung it in his shop. The sound of crunching stone and the whir of air against bicycle spokes caught their attention and pulled them back from their moment of reflection. Ed glanced toward the partially open door in time to see a blur of blue bike whiz past. Jean turned toward the door. What was that? Ed jumped from the stool to look out the window over the wood bench. He saw just the back of Jamie as she raced her bike down the path between the house and barn and off into the field. It was Jamie on her bike. Where in the world would she be off to? Jean craned her neck to look out the window, too. I don't know, but I saw her coming back from there this morning, too. He turned and leaned against the workbench. She didn't know I saw her. She looked like she was on a mission then, too. She would have been late to school based on the time she went by, but I couldn't get out there fast enough to ask any questions. Jean picked up his glass. Do you want more iced tea? No, thanks. He gave her a kiss, but it hit the spot. I appreciate it. He picked up a cloth and rubbed it along the top and sides of the wooden chest. Do you think we should call Melissa? Jean balanced the tray against her hip and put the 2 glasses back on it next to the half-full pitcher. Ed didn't look up from his work. Nah, let's not involve her mother just yet. She may have a perfectly good explanation for why she's going out there. I'll watch for Jamie and have a chat when she comes back through. She can't stay out in the woods forever. That's true. Jean tipped her head as if listening for something. I think the bus is coming up the road. Haley will be here in a minute. Ed stopped working and stood. Let's meet her in the driveway so she doesn't come in here and see the chest. She can be a chatterbox, and she might accidentally spill the beans. The bus brake squealed as it stopped at the end of the driveway. Jean and Ed hurried out of the wood shop, and he closed the door behind him. Haley trotted up the driveway. Hi, Grammy. Hi, Gramps. Ed opened his arms wide, and she accelerated to a sprint, jumping into his hug when she reached him. When he picked her up and swung her around, Haley giggled gleefully. How was your day, Shortcake? After swinging her around twice, he lowered her to the ground. She wobbled while she tried to regain her balance. I won a ribbon in the spelling bee. She hoisted the blue ribbon up so her grandparents could see it. Jean leaned over to look closer. Congratulations, Haley. What was the hardest word? Haley scrunched up her nose. Water. W-A-T-E-R. That's the word that Tommy W. couldn't spell. He said D instead of T, so I won. And everybody cheered and told me good job. She beamed at her grandparents, then holding the ribbon out in front of her, twirled like a ballerina. Now I have a ribbon just like Jamie. Well, why don't we go in and celebrate with some ice cream, Jean suggested. Okay. Haley grabbed her grandmother's free hand and they started toward the house, Haley skipping next to her. I want to call Mommy first to tell her about my ribbon and to see if they found Atticus. Jean glanced back at Ed with a surprised look. We didn't know Atticus was missing. Charlotte called this morning. Mommy and Jamie went to school late because they were helping her look for him. I wanted to help too, but Jamie said no. She gave a pouty face for a moment. She said I was a bigger help if I didn't help. I still don't understand that. Dogs usually find their way home eventually, Ed said, especially when they're hungry. He started back toward the wood shop. Grampy, are you coming in to celebrate my ribbon too? Ed chuckled. You mean celebrate, he said, carefully pronouncing the word syllable by syllable. I have something I have to do right now, but I'll be in a little later, Shortcake. You and your grandma go ahead and start the celebration. Okay. And with that, Haley chattered all the way into the house, never allowing her grandmother a chance to talk. The wooden screen door to the side porch squealed when they opened it, and then slapped shut behind them. Ed crossed the driveway to the wood shop, but stopped at the door to stare down the path toward the woods. As had become the routine, Atticus heard Jamie coming through the woods and was standing on the bench barking a greeting when she approached. Once the door was unlocked, he catapulted out, nearly knocking Jamie over as he danced around her legs. She laughed at his exuberance. I wish everyone was as happy to see me as you are. She jumped around, encouraging him to try and catch her. He played for a moment, and then as if he suddenly realized nature was calling, made his rounds on the trees. When he bounded back, he followed Jamie into the cabin. His water bowl was tipped over, and there was still food in his food dish. Jamie righted the metal bowl and refilled it with water. "You're going to be a thirsty boy if you waste your water like that, silly." Atticus pushed his muzzle into her arm, eager for a drink. "And why didn't you finish your breakfast?" She picked up the dish with the leftover food and tossed the uneaten kibble out into the woods in front of the cabin. "Well, you won't starve, that's for sure." She heard something move behind her and jumped back when the Kong rolled a bit in the corner. As if it would make a difference, she tiptoed toward the red toy and then gingerly tapped it with the toe of her sneaker. When nothing happened, she tapped again, and it shifted a bit. Atticus lunged in, grabbing the Kong in his teeth. His low growl echoed in the cabin. He tossed it into the air and let it thud to the ground. Jamie snatched it before he could grab it again. Just as she lifted it to look in the little hole in the bottom, a tiny furry face with frightened beady eyes poked out. "Ah!" Startled, she dropped the toy and jumped back, nearly tripping over Atticus, who was attempting to get around her legs. A brown mouse scurried from the opening and scuttled across the dirt floor and out the door. Atticus raced after it. "Atticus, no!" Jamie commanded. At first he didn't respond, so she repeated the command. The second time he stopped, but whimpered in protest. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt the pounding of her heart. After a few deep breaths, she started to laugh. A baby mouse she had screamed at and been frightened by something barely as big as her thumb. "We're a brave pair." She picked up the Kong and put it on the bench. Atticus sat and stared at the shelf with the treats. "Yeah, like you've earned one of those." Jamie took a package down from the shelf, and Atticus's eyebrows shot up, lifting alternately as he stared at the blue bag. She took out a few morsels, put some in her pocket, and extended one between her thumb and finger toward Atticus. He took it gently, barely touching her skin when he removed it. When he'd eaten that, he pushed his wet nose into her palm, seeking more. "Nope. We'll save the others for practicing your commands. Want to go for a swim?" Atticus jumped to all fours and began panting, his tail fanning the air. Jamie loved how expressive his face was. Oftentimes she swore he was smiling, and this was one of those times when it looked like the sides of his mouth curled up especially high. "Where's your tennis ball, Addie?" Jamie looked around the cabin for the tennis ball she'd left for Atticus. She looked under the bench and in the corners. What'd you do with it? Perplexed, she propped her hands on her hips and slowly scanned the small room. "There aren't that many places you can hide something like that, Atticus. What could you have done?" Her eyes settled on his blanket on the bench. He had scratched at it and scrunched it up, and one edge looked suspiciously round. Jamie lifted the corner. Next to her, Atticus's ears perked up and his tail wagged even faster. "What? Are you trying to hatch this thing?" Jamie laughed again. There was no doubt Atticus was good for her. Even in the worst of times, he made her feel better, whether intentionally or not. "Let's go, buddy." With a tennis ball in hand, they left the cabin. The cabin was built on top of a small hill that sloped down to a stream bed. Jamie and Atticus worked their way down the side of the hill, avoiding rocks, animal holes, and twisted roots that jutted from the ground. She slipped and fell on her bottom at one point, sliding a few feet along the dried leaves. Atticus jumped around her as if he wanted to stop her descent. "Yeah, you're a big help," she said, as she stood to brush the dirt and leaves from the back of her shorts. They continued down to the bottom of the hill. The stream bed, usually trickling with water, was bone dry from weeks of no rain. Jamie glanced upstream toward the small waterfalls. She could see a tiny amount of water dripping over the shale that hung out over a small pool below. "Well, it looks like we'll have to go downstream to the field and out to the pond," she told Atticus. He darted around her, running up the slopes, sniffing trees, shoving his nose into holes he uncovered under leaves, and chasing the occasional chipmunk that ventured out as they approached. Jamie's father had taught her last year that this stream bed led to a pond in a field at the edge of the woods. She was sure there would be water in that since it was spring-fed and not dependent on the stream for replenishing. Atticus kept his nose to the air, and as they drew closer, he must have sensed the pond was near. He raced forward, then turned back and loped toward Jamie, barking as if begging her to go faster. She could see the woods were getting lighter, which meant the forest wasn't as dense and they were near the open field. The croaks of the frogs that lived in the pond broke the stillness. Once they reached the edge, the pond was in front of them, in a field surrounded by woods on all sides. The sun just barely past midway in the sky reflected off the still water. Jamie was now off her grandparents' property. According to her father, the pond had once been stocked with bass, trout, and bullheads. It was part of a campground for local Boy and Girl Scout troops. Instead of cabins, they had camped with tents. In 4 places were the remnants of timbers that formed the perimeter for tent bases. Wild grasses and weeds sprouted up in the leftover sand in the middle. It had been many years since it had been used for that purpose. Her father and uncle had still come out to the pond to fish on occasion and had brought her a few times, but mainly they used it as their opportunity to get away and reconnect as siblings alone. At times her grandfather joined them, but these were only for a few hours here and there. Recently, local teenagers had discovered the narrow driveway through the woods that led to the pond and campsite. Near an old fire pit, beer cans and liquor bottles littered the ground. She kicked at a can as she walked by, sending it into the charred remains of small logs. An old rickety dock stretched out 15 feet over the water. The legs were made of metal and still offered some stability, but slats on the top of the dock near the first part had splintered or broken completely. Surprisingly, out near the end, the boards were still intact. Jamie picked her way past the broken slats, ignoring the bit of sway as they walked, until they were at the end. Atticus pranced next to her, waiting for the signal to jump into the water. His head bobbed between looking at the water and looking at her. "Go," Jamie commanded. Without hesitation, Atticus launched off the dock and into the pond. The water sprayed up, and she quickly hopped back, hoping to dodge the worst of the dousing. Droplets splattered against her bare arms and legs. Atticus paddled in circles near the end of the dock, waiting for her to throw the tennis ball. She lobbed it into the middle, and he spun in the water and glided toward it. When it was close, he snapped at it, securing it in his teeth, then turned to the dock. He flipped it toward her, and then doggy paddled in place until Jamie lay on her stomach and retrieved the ball from the water's surface. She tossed it to him several times until his movements became jerky with fatigue. "All right, let's take a break," she suggested. She walked off the dock and sat down in the grass at the edge of the pond. Atticus, reluctant to leave the water, paddled to the shallow slope but wouldn't come out. With his front paw, he scratched at the submerged rocks along the water's edge, dipping his muzzle in to grab at them with his teeth. When he discovered they were rocks, he left them and scratched at more. He worked his way toward a stand of reeds farther along the pond's edge. Jamie took off her sneakers and stretched her feet toward the water, sinking them up to her ankles. She allowed herself to be mesmerized by the ripples that radiated out from where she placed her feet. She loved the peacefulness, and at the moment, just being here made her feel close to her dad. In her imagination, she could picture him hanging his legs over the edge of the dock, the fishing pole in hand, his head thrown back in a hearty laugh at something Uncle Craig said. They were moments etched in her memory, precious moments she hoped she'd never forget. A loud splash to her left interrupted her musings. She turned in time to see Atticus prancing through the water toward her, a huge bullfrog hanging from his mouth. Its head stuck out the front, and its legs dangled lifelessly. Atticus's eyes sparkled with pride. Jamie jumped up and ran toward him. She wanted to laugh at the ridiculous picture he created, but she was concerned about the frog's well-being. "Atticus, drop it." She wanted to... Startled, his head drooped as he cowered. "Drop it," she ordered again. He lowered his head and allowed the frog to slip from his grip. It flopped into the water and lay upside down, motionless. Atticus stared forlornly at the water, apparently disappointed to give up his prize. Then, as if stunned to still be alive, the bullfrog thrust its long, shiny legs in the air to heave itself around, and then leaped into the deeper deeper part of the water. Atticus lunged toward it. "No," Jamie said again. Atticus tucked his tail between his legs and, keeping his head lowered, slinked over next to her. Good boy, Atticus. That was a good boy. His head came up and he tipped it in confusion. Jamie pulled a small treat from her pocket and offered it to him. Good listening, Atticus. While he chewed, she petted the top of his head. She was thankful that his instinct was to retrieve the prey gingerly so as not to damage it before taking it to the master, the hunter. She imagined the frog might have some sore spots, but it would survive. A bee buzzed in the clover nearby. Everything around here was so normal, so routine. But once she got out of here, life was anything but routine. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and checked the time. Haley would be at their grandparents' now. Charlotte would wonder where she was. She needed to get Atticus back to the cabin and get to the kennel before anyone became suspicious. Playtime's over, Addie. Let's go. Atticus jumped from the water and paused next to Jamie. Before she had time to react, he arched his back and shook the water from his coat. The spray covered the front of her. Thanks a lot. As much as she wanted to be annoyed, she couldn't help but smile. She knew it was coming, but she was so distracted with the time that she hadn't reacted quickly enough. She wiped the drops from her face. Between falling down on the hill and Atticus drenching her, she'd be a mess by the time she got through. Then she remembered the spare clothes she'd left in the cabin. She had 2 changes for exactly this purpose. At least that was one part of her plan that she'd thought out well. Back at the cabin, she used an old towel to dry Atticus a little more. She wrinkled her nose as she patted him down. P.U. Why do wet dogs have to smell so bad? He stretched his muzzle up toward her as if trying to answer. It's bad enough when it's a bath, but pond water just makes you smell gross. He pushed his body against her as if that would help. No, I don't need the smell on me too. Thanks anyway, pal. She finished drying him the best she could and then changed her clothes before she gave him more treats. She refilled his Kong, wondering if it was a wise thing to do. She didn't want to attract more mice. It was one of his favorite toys and necessary to keep him from getting bored, so she had to take the chance. I'll be back later, Atticus. You be a good boy while I'm gone. In a couple of days, you can go home. She hesitated and then said under her breath, I hope. As soon as she closed the door, he immediately started scratching at the other side. Her heart broke having to leave him. She knew he didn't understand, but that didn't make it any easier. He barked and howled the whole time she was walking back through the woods. If the cabin had been any closer to the clearing, probably her grandparents would have been able to hear the ruckus he was creating. But once she was at her bike where the woods met the field, she couldn't hear him any more either. She hoped it was because he'd settled down and not just because she was now so far away. She'd barely started down the path and field when her cell phone rang. She stopped her bike and pulled the phone from her pocket. She didn't recognize the number, but flipped the phone open anyway. Hello? Hey, Jamie. She immediately recognized Kyle's voice. Kyle, hi. Hi. Did you find Atticus yet? She didn't want to lie. The worst part about her plan was finding ways to answer people's questions evasively so that she wasn't lying. She was going to be in enough trouble as it was. At least she could say she never actually lied to anyone. Maybe omitted some important information, but so far she hadn't really lied. I haven't been to the kennel yet. There, that was the truth, and maybe he'd read into her reply that she didn't have an answer. We got all the posters hung up at lunchtime today. It was nice of Dr. McConley to let us leave school to hang them, wasn't it? Uh-huh. Jamie couldn't believe she was having this conversation with Kyle Cody. She couldn't help wondering if he was showing interest because he felt sorry for her, was worried about Atticus, or if he was genuinely interested in her. She hoped it was the last 2 combined. My mom said she'd drop me off at the kennel to help you look. How about if I meet you there? Then, if they already found Atticus, we can celebrate instead. Maybe take him for a walk together or something, okay? Jamie's tongue felt thick. Was it okay? What girl wouldn't want to be her right now? Why was it so hard to say yes? Oh, I don't want you to go to any trouble. I'd like to, Jamie. It'll give us a chance to get to know each other better, too. There was a long pause. Besides, there's something I'd like to ask you. Jamie perked up. What? It's something I have to do in person. What do you say? Should I meet you there? Yes, she blurted out before she could stop herself. Good. His voice sounded like he was smiling. Jamie closed her eyes, and she could picture the dimpled grin that made every 8th grade girl's heart race. I'll see you in about half an hour. Okay, bye. Her voice sounded breathless, and then she realized it was because she was trying to catch her breath. She'd never felt this way before. She remembered her mother once telling her that when she'd met Jamie's father, he'd taken her breath away, and then they fell in love. Jamie snapped her phone shut. Okay, maybe everything wasn't so horrible right now after all. She pushed off on the pedals. The warm wind blew her hair back, and she couldn't stop her smile if she tried. As she approached the entrance to the driveway between her grandparents' house and barn, she slowed down. She wasn't sure if Haley was watching out a window, and she sure didn't need her blabbing to everyone that she saw Jamie coming from the woods. She cruised past the porch and was almost to the wood shop when the door swung open and Grandpa Reston stepped out. She threw her hand up to wave, hoping to look natural. Hi, Grandpa. Hi, Jamie. Have a minute for your old granddad? He had a cloth in his hand that he wadded up and shoved partway into his back pocket. Sure. She braked the bike and slid off the seat to straddle the middle bar. He gestured toward a wooden swing under the maple tree. Can you sit for a minute? Not really, Grandpa. I have to get over to the kennel. He nodded. I heard Atticus is missing. Has he been found yet? Charlotte hasn't called me, she answered. There it was again. A way to answer his question without really answering it, so it wasn't a lie. Well, then I'm sure you're needed over there to help find him. Yeah, I guess. He nodded again as if pondering something important. I noticed you went to school late this morning. Heat rushed to her ears. Yeah, Mom let me help Charlotte. Grandpa cleared his throat and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Jamie was struck by how much her grandfather resembled her father in times like this. When they were both serious, their body language was exactly the same. And Grandpa's body language right now was telling her that he had something more to say, but wasn't sure how to say it. This is the second time today that I've seen you come out of the woods. He looked up at her with brown eyes that weren't accusing, more curious. She had no idea what to say. All this time she was worried about Haley seeing her, when in fact it was her grandfather she should have been concerned about. She hadn't seen him this morning. I like it back there. Dad and I used to take walks in the woods when we wanted to talk. Grandpa squinted up toward the sun that was filtered by the trees. You miss your dad a lot, don't you? Jamie's throat constricted. Yeah, I do. Her voice was almost a squeak. Grandpa cleared his throat again and then looked up at her. Me too. He stepped closer and put his hand on Jamie's shoulder. It was so warm and comforting there, like he had the power to solve any problem she ever had. I know I can't take the place of your dad, but is there anything you'd like to talk with me about? I'm okay. Her face flushed and she couldn't look into her grandfather's eyes. Did he know she had Atticus hidden in the cabin? Was he testing her? He gave her shoulder a slight squeeze and dropped his hand. Well, you know I'm always here if you need anything, right? Her lower lip quivered and she fought the welling of tears. She wanted to hug him, but she knew if she did, she'd blurt everything out. Yeah, thanks, Grandpa. I'm kind of late. I better get to the kennel. She put her foot on the bike pedal and pushed off. I'll see you later, Grandpa. Jamie, he called when she was almost at the end of the driveway. She stopped the bike and looked over her shoulder. Yeah? Just be careful when you're in the woods. There are spiders that bite. Jamie stared at him for a moment. Oh, what a tangled web we weave. Was he warning her, or just being typical Grandpa with one of his sayings? She had no way of knowing, and the unknown put her nerves on edge. That's the end of chapter 7. As you can see, Jamie has herself in a little bit of a difficult situation in a lot of ways. She's trying hard not to lie, but she's kind of not telling the truth either. So think about that and think about how that looks to other people. I expect to read it again tomorrow at 1:30, chapter 8. Check my chapter by chapter with author Lori Gifford Adams page, just in case it gets postponed again. Work meetings do come up, and work does come first. But I'm happy that we were able to get together now. And for those who are reading Attic Letters with me, I'll see you tonight. Have a good afternoon and stay safe and healthy. Bye.